Welcome to the Sleepy Journeys Through Fairytales podcast, your sanctuary to learn while you sleep. My name's Jack, and I'm so happy to have you here with me. Tonight we're going to embark on a gentle journey into the Tale of Cinderella. In a quiet corner of a long-forgotten land, far beyond busy cities and towering spires, there was a village tucked between rolling hills and whispering woods. It was the kind of place where time seemed to slow, and the air carried the hush of distant lullabies. The cobbled streets curved gently beneath moss-covered roofs, and ivy crept sleepily across cottage walls, wrapping itself like a shawl around old stone. The sky, at this hour, shimmered in hues of soft lavender and rose gold. Stars, not yet bright but patiently waiting, blinked awake in the tender light of dusk. A single chimney puffed a curling thread of smoke into the cooling sky, as the last embers of the day glowed behind windows that flickered with candlelight. The birds had settled in the trees, tucked beneath their wings, and the world was gently preparing for rest. This is the hour where stories come alive, not with grand fanfare, but with the soft padding of footsteps on worn wood floors and the gentle creak of rocking chairs. Here, in this quiet little place, the story of Cinderella begins, like the unfurling petals of a night-blooming flower. A tale whispered rather than declared. A memory wrapped in layers of time and tenderness. The Cinderella you may know wore glass slippers and danced with a prince. And while that is true, the story we share tonight moves slower, softer, and deeper. It does not race to the ball or rush to midnight. Instead, we begin with the hush of ashes falling softly on stone, the rhythmic brushing of the hearth, and the faintest trace of moonlight glinting off glass hidden in shadow. We explore her world in heartbeats, in hushes, and in dreams. Imagine her world now, a kitchen lit only by the golden glow of fire, the scent of warm bread cooling on the windowsill, the sound of sparrows chirping just before night takes full hold, a broom leaning in the corner, a kettle whispering on the hob, and a girl, her face smudged with soot, her heart quietly strong, sitting beside the flames with her thoughts drifting like smoke toward the stars above. She does not know yet of magic or princes. She only knows kindness and patience, and the way her fingers press gently into the soil when she tends the garden. She knows the names of the birds, the way to braid ivy into wreaths, and how to fold dreams into silence. And in this stillness, dear listener, we begin. Let your breath slow. Let the weight of the day melt into your mattress. Allow your thoughts to wander gently, like footsteps on a winding forest path. Tonight, we will walk beside Cinderella, through her quiet world, her small wonders, and the hush of a life lived gently. In her story, we will find stillness. In her journey, we will find rest. So let us begin, slowly, softly, together. Let the tale unfold like a dream just beginning to form. Before the story shimmered with gowns and glass slippers, there was a quieter chapter, one built of soot and silence, where each day unfolded in the flickering light of the hearth. The house was large, but not warm. Its grand windows let in light, but not comfort, and its many rooms echoed with the kind of stillness that settles in places where laughter is rarely heard. Yet beneath the kitchen's low-beamed ceiling, where firelight danced across stone walls and wooden shelves, a soft rhythm persisted, gentle, enduring, unhurried. Here, in this quiet place, Cinderella moved with the steady grace of someone who had learned to find beauty in repetition. The morning began with the sweep of the broom, its bristles brushing against worn flagstones in long, careful strokes. Ash clung to the edges of the hearth like memories reluctant to be let go. Each motion she made was practiced, fluid, clearing ashes, stacking logs, rinsing the basin, wringing linens, folding napkins. Her clothes were simple and earth-toned, patched here and there with threads of lavender and sage green. They held the scent of lavender water, of flower, of fresh earth from the garden. Though worn, they were tidy. Her hands, though often red from water and work, moved with reverence. They smoothed tablecloths and polished brass handles with a quiet desire to make her world a little more peaceful. Above the fireplace hung an old iron kettle, and beside it a wooden spoon that had belonged to her mother. Cinderella would stir porridge in it every morning, humming tunelessly while the fire snapped softly beside her. Her only audience was the ticking of the wall clock and the cooing of doves who had built their nests just outside the window. Sometimes, a shaft of morning light would pierce through the small glass panes and land across the flagstones like a silent blessing. In these rare moments, the ash on the floor would glisten faintly, like frost. She did not complain. She had learned, in her own way, to find contentment in small rituals, the way warm water felt on a cold morning, the way folded linen could stack into neat, satisfying towers, the way silence itself could be a balm. There was music in the rhythm of her work and peace in its predictability. Outside, the world stirred. Carts rattled down the roads. Hooves clopped over cobblestones. Inside, the kitchen remained its own small universe, a sanctuary shaped by motion and memory. Cinderella did not think often of other lives or other places. She lived within each task, fully, and in doing so, she wove calm into her surroundings like thread through a tapestry. This was life beneath the hearth, not a life of grandeur, but one of presence. Not loud, not hurried, just quietly, completely hers. Though her days passed in routine, there were moments, tucked in between the sweeping and the mending, when Cinderella allowed her thoughts to drift beyond the edges of her chores. These moments came like gentle breezes through an open window, subtle and soothing. They arrived while she stirred the soup, or while her fingers combed through grains of rice spilled across the pantry floor. In those quiet pauses, she would close her eyes for just a moment and dream. She never said her wishes aloud, not in the way stories sometimes tell us. Hers were not declarations sent to the sky, but softer things, quieter things. They were shaped like whispers and wrapped in hush. A breath held while gazing at the stars. A silent hope folded into the way she knotted her apron strings. A glimmer of longing tucked beneath the way she arranged dried flowers on the windowsill. At night, when the fire had burned low and shadows stretched long across the kitchen walls, she would sit on the worn stool near the hearth. The house would be still by then, save for the creaking of old timbers and the faint call of an owl outside. In that hush, she would lean her cheek against her hand, gaze into the glowing embers, and allow herself to imagine. She imagined a place of kindness, a space where her laughter might echo freely, where no one scowled at her presence or dismissed her quiet joy. She imagined warmth, not from fire alone, but from the company of those who saw her, not as a servant, not as a shadow, but as someone real and whole. She imagined walking without rush, wearing soft shoes and a dress of her own choosing, not of scraps and stitched seams. Sometimes she imagined her mother's voice, though it had faded with time. She imagined it humming through the walls like a familiar tune carried on the wind. She imagined hands brushing her hair, tucking it gently behind her ear, and calling her by name, not in command, but in care. She never cried during these moments. Her wishes were not soaked in sorrow. They were shaped by stillness, not sadness. They were born from a heart that remained open, even in hardship. And perhaps it was this, the way she tended hope like one tends a garden, that made her dreams glimmer so softly, even in the quietest hours. The doves outside her window often returned to roost at twilight. She would watch them settle on the ledge, cooing and fluttering as if sharing secrets. Sometimes, when she felt brave, she would whisper her wishes to them. And though the doves never spoke back, they stayed. Always. As if listening. And so, her wishes lingered. They floated through the kitchen like warmth. They settled into the fibers of the curtains, the grain of the wooden table, the delicate petals of the dried roses she kept pressed between pages of an old, unread book. Wishes without urgency. Dreams without weight. Hope that hummed like a lullaby in her chest, soft and slow. Beyond the chores and the soot, beyond the long hours and quiet sighs, there was something at the center of Cinderella's world that never dimmed, her gentle heart. It was not the kind of kindness that called attention to itself, nor was it worn like a banner or proclaimed aloud. No, hers was the sort of kindness that lived in subtle moments, in the quiet way one moves through the world with care. She tended to the small things, the things others overlooked. The chipped bowl that still held warmth just the same. The drooping plant in the corner that she watered gently, even when others said it was beyond saving. The cat that others scolded for shedding or stealing crumbs, which she simply let curl on her lap when the afternoon light poured through the window. In the garden behind the kitchen, a narrow strip of land was her favorite place. There, nestled between two leaning fences, grew rows of herbs, wildflowers, and a few vegetables. It was not a grand garden. The soil was rocky, and the sun passed over it quickly in the day, but still it bloomed under her care. She knew just how much water each plant needed, when to speak to the shoots, and which ones liked the morning sun best. It was here she knelt in silence, the fabric of her skirt catching on twigs, her fingers dusted with earth. She worked with care, never haste, humming faintly as bees drifted by. Animals, too, felt this gentleness in her presence. Birds did not flutter away when she approached. Mice skittered near her feet without fear. Even the neighbor's old dog, who barked at nearly everyone else, would rest his head on her foot if she passed by. They knew. Somehow, they always knew. She saw them not as pests or burdens, but as companions, quiet witnesses to the rhythm of her days. Her steps were measured, not hurried. She paused to straighten the crooked corner of a rug, to gently lift a beetle from the path and place it back among the leaves. She did these things not for praise, not because she was watched, but because it felt right. Her heart responded to the world with tenderness, not in grand gestures, but in the way she listened to the wind, to the floorboards, to the spaces between sounds. Kindness was her strength, not the kind sung about in songs of valor or chivalry, but the kind that lives in the everyday, in the decision to keep loving even when love is not returned, in the effort to keep things beautiful, even in a place where beauty is often forgotten, in the refusal to let cruelty dim the warmth of one's own spirit. And so, with every chore, every planted seed, every whispered good night to the mice who scurried under the cupboards, Cinderella moved through her world like a lullaby, not trying to change everything at once, but simply making each small moment a little more gentle than it was before. At night, when the sky unrolled its dark velvet cloak and scattered stars across it like tiny lanterns, Cinderella would sometimes step outside, just beyond the kitchen door, where a little stone path led to the edge of the garden. The earth would still be warm from the day, and the air soft with the scent of chamomile and turned soil. These moments beneath the stars were hers alone, untouched by commands or chores, unclaimed by anyone else in the house. She would stand there in the hush, the cool night brushing her cheeks, her hands clasped loosely before her. Above her, the stars blinked slowly into clarity, one by one, like the kind eyes of old friends. These starlit visits were quiet remembrances of a time when the house had felt different, softer, livelier, when voices filled the hallways with warmth and footsteps echoed with laughter instead of obligation. Her memories of her mother were like those stars, distant but steady, comforting, like a lullaby half remembered. She would recall the way her mother used to sing at dusk, her voice gentle as it floated through the rooms, carrying old melodies with no names. Cinderella could still hear those tones in the wind sometimes, or in the rustling leaves. Her mother had always spoken softly, even when instructing, even when correcting. Her hands had smelled of soap and lavender, and her eyes always seemed to smile, even when her mouth did not. There was a small bench near the garden gate, old and crooked, but still standing. Sometimes Cinderella would sit there, wrap her shawl around her shoulders, and close her eyes. The chill of the stone seeped through the cloth, grounding her in the moment, while the warmth of memory swirled around her. She imagined her mother beside her, quiet, like always, perhaps pointing to a star, telling her its name, tracing constellations with her finger in the air. Even now, those names lingered in her thoughts: Orion, Cassiopeia, the swan. She had forgotten the stories behind them, but not the sound of her mother's voice as she said them. These memories were never overwhelming. They didn't stir tears or sorrow. They were like the stars themselves, constant companions in the night, lighting her path just enough. Her grief had softened with time, worn smooth by repetition and remembrance, until what remained was a calm ache and a deep gratitude. She didn't ask the stars for anything. She didn't wish aloud. She simply stood with them, beneath them, among them. They were her witnesses, her quiet comfort, a tether to all that had been beautiful before. And as she returned inside each night, brushing dirt from her skirt and closing the door gently behind her, a single thought would often settle over her like a blanket: that love, once given, never truly leaves. It lingers, in stars, in songs, in small gestures, and it is always, quietly, enough. The morning was like any other. Light filtered softly through the wavy glass panes of the kitchen window, illuminating dust motes that drifted lazily in the air. The scent of bread baking mingled with the coolness of dawn, and Cinderella was at the table, quietly shelling peas into a wooden bowl. The rhythm of her fingers, the faint crack and plop of each pod opening, created a gentle tempo that matched the hush of the house. Outside, the village was beginning to stir. Wheels rolled over stone, roosters announced the day's arrival, and from somewhere distant, a bell chimed the hour. Yet even these sounds seemed muffled, as though wrapped in the drowsy folds of morning. Then came the knock. Just 3 simple raps upon the door, firm, deliberate, and oddly expectant. Cinderella looked up. A pause hung in the air like a held breath. She wiped her hands on her apron and moved to the door, opening it slowly. Standing just beyond the threshold was a courier dressed in deep blue with golden trim. His boots were dusted from the road, and in his gloved hands he held a scroll, thick and cream-colored, tied with a red ribbon and sealed with a glint of wax. It bore the royal emblem, a lion and a lily, entwined. He bowed with a practiced flourish, said nothing, and handed her the scroll. Then, with the same quiet presence, he turned and walked back down the lane, his cloak fluttering slightly in the breeze. Cinderella stood in the doorway for a long moment, the scroll resting lightly in her hands, as if it weighed nothing at all. The ribbon fluttered slightly in the morning air, catching the light like a flicker of flame. She did not hurry to untie it. Instead, she closed the door gently behind her, walked back to the table, and sat down with the scroll across her lap. She turned it in her hands, feeling the texture of the parchment, smooth, but with a certain age to it, as if it had waited years just for this moment. Her fingers hesitated at the ribbon. For a moment she wondered if it was meant for someone else. Perhaps they had delivered it to the wrong door. But when she finally untied the ribbon and broke the seal, the scroll unfurled with a slow elegance, like the petal of a flower opening to the light. The script was ornate, curling and looping with care. It read, "By command of His Royal Highness, the Crown Prince, all eligible maidens of the kingdom are hereby invited to attend a grand ball at the royal palace. This gathering shall take place under the moonlight 3 nights hence, in celebration of His Highness's return. Attire of dignity is requested. Music and supper will be provided. An invitation, a possibility, wrapped in parchment and sealed in gold." Cinderella read it twice, then set it carefully on the table, her eyes lingering on the closing line. "All are welcome who dream of something more." She traced those words with her fingertip, slow and deliberate, as if memorizing them. Then she looked out the window at the morning sky, which had shifted from gray to a soft, hopeful blue. Something had changed. The scroll lay open on the table for the rest of the day, its parchment edges curling slightly at the corners as the light shifted across the floor. Though no one spoke of it, it seemed to hum with quiet possibility, a delicate tension that fluttered in the corners of the room like a breeze that hadn't quite settled. Cinderella didn't speak of the invitation. She went about her chores as she always did, moving from room to room, her hands steady, her expression unchanged. But inside her something was stirring, softly, cautiously. Not quite hope, not quite excitement, but something tender and unnamed. A warmth, perhaps, or a pull. That evening, when the house had grown quiet and the moonlight streamed through the upstairs window, she made her way to the attic. The attic was a forgotten place, Dust clung to rafters, and the scent of old wood and linen filled the air. Boxes were stacked like silent watchers along the edges of the room, and a single chair sat beneath the window, its cushions sun-bleached and threadbare. This was where remnants of the past slumbered, wrapped in muslin and tucked into corners no one else cared to visit. She knew what she was looking for. In the farthest corner, beneath a folded coverlet and a box of dried flowers, lay a wooden chest with a brass clasp, dulled by time. She knelt before it, lifted the lid, and paused. Inside, resting like a memory preserved in stillness, was a dress. It was not a ball gown, not by any measure of grandeur. Its fabric was simple muslin and lace, soft ivory with fading embroidery along the hem. It had once belonged to her mother, worn on special occasions long before laughter had grown scarce in the house. Cinderella had not touched it in years. She lifted it with care. The fabric, though aged, held a lightness to it. It smelled faintly of lavender and thyme. She laid it across the chair, studying its lines. Some seams were frayed. A few places had thinned. But it was beautiful. Not because it was grand, but because it had been cherished. She gathered thread and needle, quiet as always, and began to mend. Each stitch was slow, intentional. She let her thoughts drift as she worked, sewing memories into each line. Her mother's laugh, the feel of her hand resting on her shoulder, the way the two of them once danced, barefoot, in the garden after a summer rain. As she stitched, she added her own touches, small, delicate details. A few pearls from an old hair comb sewn into the bodice. A bit of ribbon dyed with tea to bring warmth back to the sash. She patched with devotion, her fingers gentle and sure. She didn't know if she would wear it to the ball. She didn't know if she would even be allowed to go. But this act, this quiet transformation, was for her. A moment of care, of remembrance, of soft defiance. A reminder that even in dust, there can be dignity. That even in shadow, there can be grace. And when she finally folded the dress over her arms and carried it downstairs, the moonlight caught on a single pearl, and for just a moment, it gleamed like morning dew on untouched silk. The evening of the ball arrived quietly. The sun slipped beneath the horizon without haste, painting the sky in sleepy streaks of mauve and gold. The garden behind the house, so often overlooked, so often trodden with footsteps heading elsewhere, seemed to hold its breath. Even the breeze moved gently, stirring the tall grasses and brushing its fingertips across the leaves, as if it too was waiting. Cinderella stood at the edge of that garden in her mended dress, her hands clasped before her. The fabric, patched and softened by time, rustled gently with every movement. Her hair had been brushed until it shone, and a single ribbon held it back, its pale blue edges fluttering slightly in the dusk. There was nothing grand about her appearance, no jewels, no silk, but she carried with her a kind of quiet radiance, born from grace. She hadn't been allowed to go to the ball. The others had laughed, had pointed, had waved their own finery before her eyes. But now the house was empty, the carriage gone, and silence filled the halls. Still, she stepped outside to find her own kind of stillness beneath the stars. The moon had risen high and full, casting a silvery glow over the world. And as Cinderella stepped onto the worn path that led through the garden, something unusual began to happen. At first, it was nothing more than a glimmer in the air, a shimmer along the edges of the hedgerows, like dew catching the moonlight. Then, slowly, the garden began to glow in the way a firefly might, soft and pulsing. The flowers, closed for the night, seemed to shift slightly. The vines hanging from the arbor stirred, though no breeze moved them. The lantern she had hung earlier that week, empty of flame, began to flicker with a gentle light of its own. From among the roses stepped a figure. The figure was draped in pale garments that shimmered like mist. Her eyes were kind and clear, and her smile held the warmth of 1,000 lullabies. This was not a stranger. This was not a stranger's magic. This was something remembered, familiar and soft. Cinderella did not step back. She simply stood still, her breath slow, her gaze meeting the woman's with quiet wonder. "I've been watching," the woman said, her voice barely louder than the wind in the leaves. She reached out, her hands gentle as she brushed Cinderella's cheek with her fingers. "You have kept the heart of the story alive," she murmured, "and tonight the story returns the favor." With that, the garden bloomed. Flowers opened with no sound, releasing a delicate perfume. Vines wrapped around each other in elegant spirals. The path lit itself in quiet silver, and the moon, ever faithful, cast its blessing down over all. And Cinderella, bathed in moonlight and wonder, stepped deeper into that garden glow, her dress rustling like a song sung in sleep. The garden, now aglow with silvery light, held a hush that was deep and sacred. The kind of hush that arrives when something old and magical begins to stir. Around Cinderella, petals fluttered in midair like feathers. Vines coiled in elegant spirals around trellises, and the air shimmered faintly as though lit from within. The woman, neither old nor young, neither earthly nor distant, stood beside Cinderella with her palms open. Her eyes reflected the stars, and her smile was calm, knowing. "Tonight," she said softly, "you shall go." Cinderella did not speak. She simply listened, her heart quietly full, her eyes wide with wonder. She watched as the woman knelt beside a worn patch of earth and rested her hand on a small round pumpkin nestled among the leaves. There was no flash of light, no thunder. The pumpkin simply shimmered, like water disturbed by a breath, and began to shift. Its skin deepened from orange to gold, then to a warm, glowing amber. It expanded, gracefully, its ridges smoothing out like polished wood. Wheels formed from tendrils of vine, and windows blinked open like sleepy eyes. Where once lay a garden pumpkin, now stood a carriage, rounded and glimmering, with a door of curling ivy and lanterns made from blossoms. It glowed like a memory, soft and welcoming. The woman turned next to a cluster of mice who had gathered at Cinderella's feet. They looked up with blinking eyes, twitching whiskers, and unspoken loyalty. With a touch of her hand, they too shimmered and grew. Their forms stretched gently into small, handsome horses with silvery manes and soft gray coats. They nuzzled Cinderella's palms before trotting over to the carriage, where elegant harnesses of braided grass and silk awaited them. A lizard, pale and sleepy beneath a garden stone, stirred next. He blinked once, then again, and with a soft ripple of magic, he became the coachman, tall and kind-eyed, with gloved hands and a quiet, knowing smile. He nodded once, as if this were a duty long awaited. Then, with care and grace, the woman turned back to Cinderella. Her dress, mended with thread, patterned with memories, shimmered gently in the garden light. The stitches loosened, releasing, like petals opening at dawn. The muslin shifted to silk, not loud and grand, but flowing and luminous, like moonlight on still water. Embroidery returned to life, floral patterns twining delicately along the hem and sleeves, blooming beneath her gaze. Her shoes, worn and soft with use, lightened in her hands. They grew clear, like crystal touched by dew. Glass slippers, they would be called. But in truth, they looked like something spun from morning frost and held together by breath. Cinderella looked down at herself with awe, not because she had become someone else, but because she had become more fully herself, not hidden beneath soot or silence, but seen, simply, beautifully, as she was. The woman placed a hand on Cinderella's shoulder. "You may stay until midnight," she said gently. "Then, as all magic must, this too will return to its resting form. But the memory, it will stay. The kindness, the hope, that is yours to keep." And with that, the carriage door opened with a soft creak. The horses pawed the ground gently. The coachman waited, hands folded. Cinderella stepped forward. Her heart was calm, her breath steady. And as she took her seat, cradled in light and wonder, the carriage turned onto the garden path and began to move, slowly at first, then smoothly, like a dream slipping gently into motion. The night had begun. The path to the palace wound through the quiet countryside, where meadows stretched out beneath the stars, and soft fog drifted like silk over the fields. The carriage wheels turned without a sound, as though the very earth beneath them had softened to allow its passage. Cinderella sat within, her hands resting gently in her lap, her breath slow, her heart steady, with a stillness as wide and deep as the sky above her. As they approached the palace gates, the scenery began to shimmer. trees stood like sentinels along the avenue, their leaves catching moonlight in silver flashes. Above, lanterns floated on unseen threads, bobbing gently in the air like tiny stars that had come down from the heavens to light the way. Their glow was soft, like candlelight filtered through lace. The palace itself rose from the hill like a dream carved in stone. Its towers stretched upward with quiet grace, their peaks dissolving into the velvet night. Windows flickered with golden light, and the distant echo of music drifted down through the warm air. It welcomed with a quiet invitation, like a lullaby played on wind and memory. As the carriage came to a stop before the grand steps, the horses settled into stillness and the coachman stepped down, opening the door with a gentle bow. Cinderella stepped out onto the smooth flagstones, her slippers nearly silent as they touched the ground. Around her, other guests had arrived in gowns of satin and brocade, their laughter light and quick, their movements like ripples on a pond. Yet somehow, none of them dimmed her presence. She stood a moment beneath the lanterns, her face tilted toward the sky. She took in the quiet joy around her, the rustling of silk, the faint scent of roses and polished wood, the harmony of strings from within. And then, with quiet purpose, she climbed the stairs. Inside, the ballroom opened like the petals of a great flower. Arched ceilings glittered with soft crystal. Walls were lined with tapestries depicting tales of old, knights kneeling beside stags, maidens in moonlit gardens, ships drifting on starlit seas. The floors, polished to a mirrored sheen, reflected the light in long, lazy ripples. No one turned to stare. No one whispered. Instead, as Cinderella entered, the music seemed to shift ever so slightly, as if it too recognized her arrival. A quiet harmony bloomed, and the air grew still in a way that only happens when something true has just stepped into the room. She walked slowly across the ballroom. Every movement was calm, every breath measured. She belonged not because she sought to, but because she arrived with a heart unburdened by expectation. The prince stood by the far window, his gaze on the stars. He did not turn immediately. When he did, his expression softened. He moved toward her with the same quiet certainty that had carried her here. No trumpets sounded. No voices called. Only two pairs of eyes meeting across a room filled with music and warmth. This was not a moment of discovery. It was a moment of recognition. And as they stood together, the music continued, slow, tender, timeless. The palace, bathed in lantern light and wrapped in the hush of night, became a dream that breathed. The music that floated through the ballroom moved like a soft tide, rising and falling with a tenderness. Notes curled in the air like ribbons of silk, brushing gently against stone walls and polished chandeliers, wrapping the night in a slow and soothing rhythm. Cinderella stood at the edge of the dance floor, her hands resting quietly at her sides, her breath calm. The prince approached with a warmth that needed no words. He did not bow with formality, nor did he offer grand flourishes. He simply extended his hand, his gaze meeting hers as though asking, "Shall we?" And she, with a soft smile and a small nod, placed her hand in his. Their first step was slow, almost hesitant, as if testing the air between them. The floor, a smooth expanse of light and reflection, welcomed their movement. One step, then another. A gentle sway. A turn. There was no crowd watching, no spotlight drawn. The room continued on around them, yet their presence shaped a quiet pocket of stillness in the center of the dream. They did not speak. Their language was movement, fluid, careful, rooted in grace. Her gown whispered against the floor, the glass slippers glinting softly beneath its hem. His footsteps matched hers with instinct, like two feathers caught on the same breeze. Time did not stop. It simply forgot to hurry. Around them, others danced too, elegant pairs gliding in circles, but none with quite the same quietness. For Cinderella and the prince, there was no urgency, no need to impress. Only the pure, soft joy of being seen, of being accepted without question, without disguise, without hesitation. In his presence, Cinderella did not feel small. She did not feel hidden. She felt whole, not because of a title or a ball gown, but because he listened, not with ears, but with presence. He saw the steadiness in her step, the calm in her posture, the light she carried from days spent tending gardens and speaking to doves. And he, too, was not a figure of fantasy. He was not lofty or distant. He moved with thoughtfulness, with a quiet gravity that spoke of long days beneath wide skies, of listening more than speaking, of choosing kindness where power was expected. They met as kindred spirits circling gently in time's embrace. As the song drew on, the stars above the high windows seemed to turn. The candles flickered. The violin swelled just a touch, and then receded again, like the tide drawing back from shore. And still they danced. Not to mark a moment, not to win affection, but to be. To share silence, to hold grace, to breathe together in the hush between the clock's ticking hands. This was the heart of the story, not the spell, not the slipper, but the stillness, the knowing, the trust that blooms when two people move gently through the same quiet dream. And somewhere, deep in the hush of the palace, a clock ticked on, holding the moment, carefully, like a secret. The evening unfolded gently, the way petals loosen with the touch of dew. Music wove through the corridors like a memory returning home, and golden light flickered in slow pulses from the candelabras high above. The rhythm of the ball continued, but for Cinderella, the world had narrowed to a peaceful hum. The presence of the prince beside her, the quiet sweep of her skirt, the soft coolness of the marble beneath her slippers. No one questioned who she was. No one stopped to wonder. She moved through the palace as though she had always belonged, not because of magic, but because she had carried her quiet dignity with her like a lantern all along. But even dreams, when whispered softly enough, carry within them the hush of goodbye. A subtle shift came to the air. Not abrupt, not startling, just a change in temperature, in tone. Cinderella turned her head slightly and saw the great clock across the ballroom, its long brass pendulum swinging slow and steady. The hands pointed upward, nearly meeting. Midnight, not yet arrived, but approaching, a gentle breath away. Her heart did not race, but a soft ache stirred. Not panic, just the knowledge that this too was a moment, and all moments, even the beautiful ones, pass like mist before the sun. She turned once more with the prince, completing a final circle on the polished floor. Their hands remained joined. His gaze held hers, steady and quiet. He did not know, but she did. The bells began. Deep and distant, like waves crashing in slow motion. One chime. She gave the smallest smile, like a farewell. 2 chimes. She took a single step back. 3. He reached gently for her hand, but she had already begun to move. Her slippers tapped softly against the stone as she slipped through the ballroom, her pace unhurried, but certain. The crowd parted like fog. No one stopped her. She passed through the great entryway, into the marble corridor, down the moonlit steps. 4. The carriage waited. Doves stirred in the ivy. 5. One glass slipper held firmly. 6. The other slipped loose. It landed lightly upon the top step, catching the moonlight in its delicate curve, as though it had always been meant to rest there. 7. She turned, only briefly, and looked back with gratitude. 8. The prince had stepped into the night air, watching from afar. 9. He saw the slipper, and then he saw the empty stair. 10. The wind stirred the trees, rustling leaves like pages turning. 11. The horses stirred, the coachman tipped his hat. 12. And then it was gone. The vines were vines once more. The mice curled in the grass. The pumpkin resting beside the gate. Cinderella, barefoot now, stood still among the soft hush of the garden. Her dress had returned to muslin. The moon glowed on her cheeks. The stars blinked, unchanged. She did not cry. She simply stepped forward, picked up the hem of her skirt, and made her way home beneath a sky that had always known her name. In the soft light of the morning, the palace stood hushed. The guests had gone. The music had faded. The lanterns had grown dim. Only a few servants moved gently through the long halls, gathering forgotten gloves and folding tapestries closed. Yet something of the night lingered, an energy that had nothing to do with the sparkle of gowns or the grandeur of the ball. In the prince's chamber, he stood still, gazing at the single glass slipper that now rested atop a velvet cloth. Its curve caught the morning light in a quiet shimmer, the way morning frost clings to blades of grass. He did not speak. He held the slipper in both hands for a long moment, as if it contained a whisper he was still learning how to hear. He remembered her, not only the glow of her dress or the clarity of her presence, but the calm, the stillness, the way the music itself had quieted when she entered the room. She had moved with grace from within, and her eyes, those steady, warm eyes, had spoken of something deeper than the magic that had briefly wrapped around her. There had been no name. No family claimed her. She had not stayed long enough to be announced. Yet the prince knew something simple and certain. He needed to find her. He had seen in her a kind of truth he'd found nowhere else. So a search began with quiet visits across the villages and cottages of the kingdom. The prince himself traveled the winding roads, carrying with him only the slipper and a sense of calm determination. Many tried the slipper. They arrived with perfumes and declarations, with practiced bows and eager eyes. But the glass never fit. Days passed. The search wound further from the palace into the countryside where the hills curved like sleeping giants and the trees whispered their secrets to the wind. It was there, one golden afternoon, that the prince's carriage slowed before a modest home with ivy-covered walls and a crooked garden gate. Inside, Cinderella knelt beside her small garden, trimming back mint and rosemary. She wore no silk, no jewelry, only her patched skirt and a soft blue ribbon holding back her hair. But as the prince stepped quietly from his carriage and walked toward her, something shifted in the air, like a melody returning to its beginning. She looked up. Their eyes met in a soft, shared knowing. The slipper was brought forth, and she held it as though greeting an old friend. She slipped her foot inside, and it fit not like fate or magic, but like comfort, like home. Yet more than the slipper, it was her kindness that he recognized. Her grace, her quiet strength that had woven beauty into the world without asking for thanks. And it was this, more than anything, that he had searched for. Not a princess, but a soul who saw the world gently and helped it grow. The days that followed passed softly, like clouds drifting over fields of wildflowers. No grand proclamations were made. No trumpets rang through the hills. The kingdom did not awaken to fanfare, but to the quiet murmur of joy carried on morning breezes and echoing through stone corridors. Cinderella did not change overnight. She still rose with the sun. She still tended the garden, brushed flour from the table, and tucked wildflowers into small vases. But the air around her felt different now, less heavy, less watchful. The shadows no longer lingered in corners. The silence of the house had become a companion rather than a cage. The palace, too, softened. Its echoing halls warmed under her gentle footsteps. The staff came to know her as a presence, steady, kind, and unassuming. She did not seek to rule or to dazzle. She brought no demands, made no lists. She simply moved through her days with a heart open to the world, as she always had, only now in a space that welcomed her fully. She still visited her garden, though now it was larger, with winding paths and stone benches tucked beneath blooming arches. Doves still perched nearby. Mice still skittered at the edge of the path. And sometimes, when the sky turned violet in the hour just before night, she would sit quietly by the gate, slippers resting beside her, bare feet in the grass, and listen to the wind. The glass slipper, the one that remained, was never locked away or displayed behind glass. It rested gently on a low shelf by the window, where the sun could find it each morning. It was treated as a reminder of stillness, of soft beginnings, of a night that had not changed who she was, but revealed it. And those stories spread, as stories do, whispers of magic, of transformation, of impossible shoes. Cinderella's truth remained quiet. Her story, she knew, was not about royalty or rescue. It was about the small, brave act of staying gentle in a world that had not always been kind. It was about tending beauty in forgotten corners, about stepping into a moment with open hands and allowing it to bloom. The prince, too, moved gently beside her. He did not try to shape her story, nor place her upon a pedestal. He simply walked with her, side by side, as they built a life rooted not in grandeur, but in grace. And so the tale settled, like snow upon a quiet field, like petals drifting to earth after bloom. Some nights, long after the palace had grown still, Cinderella would gaze out the window where stars shimmered above the hills. She would rest her chin on her hand, eyes soft with memory, and smile. Because she knew her story had not ended. It had only slowed into a lullaby, a song not of endings, but of peace. And as the wind swept gently through the curtains and the room dimmed to the soft breath of sleep, she closed her eyes and rested, held at last by all she had given to the world, quietly returned.